Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Data Resilient SpectrumCast. We are joined, as always, by my co-host, Randy Arsenault. Hey, Randy.
Hey, everybody.
And our subject matter experts, Trisha Jang and Sean Sperry. Hey, you guys.
Hello.
Hey, everybody.
And today we are joined by another, I would go beyond subject matter expert and just say our illustrious field person, Dan Thompson. Dan, you've been in the field for a long time. Thank you very much for joining us. I appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Dan's been doing a lot of things around the entire data protection portfolio and is just a wealth of knowledge. And we're really pleased to have him here. So over the course of the last few episodes, we've been talking a lot about data resilience and specifically cyber attacks and making sure that your environment is able to recover from an attack in the event that something happens. And we've talked a little bit about some of the things that you want to have in place to make sure that you can do a good job. One of the things that Dan and his team does is they have a full kind of cyber resilience how to best architect your environment, best practices, and that sort of thing that they deliver to clients. And one of those things we talk about is kind of hardening your environment. And Dan, maybe I'd turn it over to you. When we say hardening an environment, do we necessarily talk about hardening things, hardening the environment? What do we think about when we think about hardening something?
So by definition, when you harden an environment, you make it able to withstand an attack. So this is not about recovering from an attack, it's about preventing the attack from being successful. And that attack can be anything. It can be automated scripts, it can be an insider, an infiltrator, it could be someone walking into your data center with a hammer and a drill. And of course, every phone's going to ring because we're doing a podcast.
The beauty of doing it live, Dan.
Exactly. And that phone does not ring but like once a week because I do not use that but for the outgoing. And so when we talk about hardening our environment, it theoretically could be anything. It could be, hardening the power infrastructure and the physical access. But generally we talk about the machine, the operating system, and the application. In this case, Spectrum Protect or any backup applications.
Last week in our SpectrumCast around the health checks, Jason Basler brought up something pretty interesting, and I'm curious kind of your thoughts around this. He talked about, we have a lot of capabilities that make our lives in IT easier, specifically things like single sign-on was really the common one we thought of that helps us log into different systems and makes it simple so we don't have to remember so many passwords, et cetera, et cetera. And he talked about making it a little bit more difficult. Difficult ends up being a little bit more difficult for the user. Now, hopefully, if you created the password, you technically should know what they are. But a lot of times, there's a lot of restrictions on what a password can look like, and it gets a little complicated. But the point was more, if I make it difficult for myself, I'm also making it difficult for the person trying to infiltrate my environment. And I'm wondering kind of your thoughts on that, Dan.
One of the interesting things that our services folks have found when trying to help customers recover from large-scale cyber attacks is that part of the infrastructure that makes it easier to manage large-scale IT is actually attacked first. So Windows, very much the majority of the operating system attacked, but it's integrated Active Directory, for example. So if I can corrupt or gain control of the directory, now I know about all the machines that are part of the domain, and I can undermine the ability to prevent me from logging in. I can make myself an admin account across all machines and things like that. So if nothing else, you can look at taking your backup engines and removing them one step from that common point of infiltration. Don't put it on Windows. If your organization, it makes sense to put it on Windows, don't add it to the domain. Have it only local accounts that are separate. Those definitely make your day-to-day life a little more complex, but now you're not as likely to be attacked or infiltrated either automatically or through manual effort by attacking those common infrastructure points. So I think it makes a lot of sense. People do talk about avoiding the monoculture, right? If I've got all Windows, maybe I put it on Linux, because that way not the same scripts can attack me and things like that.
So would that be, is that kind of considered sort of reducing your attack surface, I think is the terminology that you hear occasionally, where making your infrastructure less penetrable or vulnerable by reducing the number of potential vulnerabilities? Or is it more a case of reducing access to those core functions and services that have the ability to paralyze the largest percentage of the infrastructure in the shortest possible time?
In general, I cannot stop myself, being the nerd that I am, from utilizing Star Trek terms. I put up my shields and I put my cloaking device on, and I know they're not compatible in Star Trek canon, but we're not going to nerd out that way. But you get the idea. Is firewalls, good security practices to prevent infiltration, but also, as you said, don't advertise, don't be part, don't have shares coming out there, don't log in and start browsing your personal email from a web browser on that machine, things like that, common sense. But it's all about reducing cross-section, as you stated, but also putting as much barriers as possible. So it's both, as a matter of fact.
So you said reducing cross-section, putting as many barriers. What would be your third, fourth, fifth item that people should take away?
The universal thing that we found with especially automated attacks, is people who don't have all the current fixes on their endpoints, on their application servers, on their file servers, and on the backup engine. So obviously keep current with all fixes. That includes the operating system, that includes firmware on the hardware, that includes the application, in this case Spectrum Protect, or your backup application. So that's the first thing. Second one is firewalls. There's no reason to expose ports that you're not needed. Other things like standard good security practices: don't let root level SSH into the machine. Make it, you log in and then sudo over or su over. Linux has something called SE Linux. AIX has something called trusted execution, and what those modules do is they prevent unauthorized changes to OS and application programs. So you have to disable that when you install a program like Spectrum Protect or anything else. What is not overly clear is that you can then re-enable it after you install. So you should have that on, and that prevents someone from injecting code into your programs, whether it's OS or the application. After that, inside of Spectrum Protect, we have command approval or dual authorization. So if Sean's going out there and he gets a change control request to remove a backups from this machine because it's been decommissioned, he issues the command, but he can't say, yes, make it so. He's got to say, Tricia, here's my change control request, review and approve. And you can say, that's great, Sean. Did you realize there were 7 years of archives on that node? He goes, oh, wow. And let me go back and make sure they want those gone as well. And that's standard human error. You can also imagine that from an infiltrator or an insider who wants to destroy things. So those are real low-hanging fruit things you can do very easily with no extra cost.
Dan, you mentioned
most of your pieces were very kind of pertinent to almost any type of system, except for the multi-administrator approval that's built into Spectrum Protect. Any other backup specific or even Spectrum Protect specific hints and tips?
Well, in general, you want to treat your backup infrastructure at least as as securely as you do the machines that it's protecting. So if I've got a tier 0 high critical application, if this database server or this application server goes down, I can't do my business. I want my backup engine to be at least as secure as that. So it's exactly right. Some of the stuff is not unique to backups. Having it isolated, like we talked about earlier, from the standard IT stuff, so it can't be attacked as easily. But also then you get the standard rules. Don't have just one copy. Have a replicated copy. You can use what we call dissimilar policies. So if I go over there and an admin reduces the retention settings so that backups will be expired earlier on one side, and that gets approved, it doesn't necessarily happen on the other side. So you can have a policy that says anything like that, even if it looks good, I'm not going to do it on the second side for a week or something. Give yourself some kind of buffer. Certainly having a copy on different sites, having a copy perhaps on the third type of technology. So if I've got a dedupe disk pull on one side and another dedupe disk pull, even if they're completely independent, and they can even be different platforms and different, subsystem types or whatever, so that no single type of attack can hit both sides easily, you may have a third copy on tape created at either side or object, right? So the more sophisticated the attack would have to be, the safer you are, right? If you've got different options. What is somewhat concerning is when we look at how can backups be corrupted, we can harden these environments as much as you can, but remember the client does its own backups, right? It sends backup data. So if someone gains access to the client, there are commands that can be said, delete my backups. I don't need this anymore. And so you can disable those on the server as well. That's not really hardening the client. It's just preventing what's probably the easiest way for people to corrupt backups is to not attack the backup engine if it's hardened and hard to get to, going out there and saying, do a backup of bad data 50 times. And you can change policies to say you can't do that. You can do 1 a day. You can't do 50 a day and things like that.
Dan, you brought up a couple of things that I've heard before and that sort of thing. So for one of the things that you'd mentioned was things like don't have everything on a Windows system, use Linux. One of the things that Jason had mentioned to us was, AIX is one of the least penetrated systems. So maybe if you can have your backup system on an AIX system, but everything else is kind of the more user friendly for the end user, but IT has to take care of that. That's an interesting one. You talk a lot about having a lot of different methodologies and policies going on inside your environment. And I think this opens it up to kind of everyone is we've heard a lot about injecting more automation into IT processes, especially around data protection. We've talked about kind of the skill level of, the older data protection administrator to kind of where we are today. And I think, we've made backup simpler, but also anytime you can automate, you can remove some of that human error, as you've talked about, Dan. Are you hearing more about folks trying to inject automation in a lot of the processes that they're doing, maybe even specifically around data protection?
We certainly have people, at IBM and our GTS, we have a business resiliency workflow manager that helps on multiple sides, like planning large-scale recoveries. That may be one thing that you can do. All of the products we're talking about, Spectrum Protect, or most modern backup engines allow you to schedule both backups and recovery. So you can have things pre-scheduled, predefined, like recover my tier 1 applications, or in a case like Spectrum Copy Data Management, take a snapshot of my key, application volumes. It's a crash consistent snapshot, but in case I get an attack and it's going on right now, let's just take a snapshot. So we have a recovery point. It may be dirty and crash consistent and coming back. So that's probably a very long answer that was not directly to your question, but we do see people trying to do things smarter. And I think a lot of the challenges or a lot of the interesting work is going on predefining your recovery or even doing testing, automated testing of recovery. And we see multiple vendors coming up with a recovery testing scenario where it randomly chooses a VM and then tests it. And you say, how do I define success? Is it opening of a specific port or, things like that. So you can automate these tests to make sure that things are going on. And certainly cyber recovery vaulting is another big issue where you've got, or another big place where you've got a third copy you created and that's actually being looked at like products from IBM or companies like Index Engines, where you're evaluating the snapshots, for example, from Protect Plus and seeing if it has valid data.
Randy, this is key for you. This is Trish's big thing. Test, 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 right?
Well, and it's interesting. It's also it brings to mind the infamous Chaos Monkey developed by Netflix, which was their automated randomized attack simulator, right? That goes out and looks for vulnerabilities, constantly goes out, and they still do this. They constantly monitor their environment and probe, for vulnerabilities and potential attack surfaces. So, to the earlier point, automation is not only, I would say, a real an important advancement. It's becoming a necessity. I mean, as the attacks get more and more sophisticated and more automated and scalar, your defenses presumably also have to be more automated and able to scale more effectively and more quickly. So,
like I say, we have an interesting red book about monitoring the file access on Spectrum Scale, or GPFS, and reporting that to QRadar. And illicit activity is reported and a snapshot created on Scale, or the Scale file system dismounted. Now we support, and one of our blueprint models has Protect using Scale as its storage, as its repository for backups. So you could combine those two concepts and say, if someone goes out there and starts deleting backup volumes, or particularly if it's not the instance owner, that's the only thing that should be writing to those, that's a big red flag of something's going on, and you can have QRadar trigger the automation to take it offline. So those are some exciting things just by combining some core functional features of our product set.
Sean, in a lot of the work that you've been doing with clients and that sort of thing, any talks around things like automation or things that you can do to make your testing easier or smarter, like Randy was talking about, like Netflix had done, that sort of thing?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of that. I guess it just strikes me that how often I talk to people, and these things are kind of broken up between, at least in my mind, between this is pretty easy to do and this can be very sophisticated and very difficult. And I'm amazed at how many people I meet that haven't really gotten through the easy part yet, and they're focused on these sophisticated, difficult methodologies, right? So my advice, at least, and I don't know how you feel about this, Dan, is to focus on the things that you can do that are easy, and don't try and necessarily start with making a huge science project out of this kind of stuff.
Yeah, and that automation, if we are automating the protection, that the 30 Russian cyber attack groups that we'll talk about in our news article today, they're automating their attacks, and they're probably constantly looking for these basic things that have been successful before. At least I would be if I was some kind of cyber hacker.
Well, and that gets back to the first recommendation I made, is the sad thing about most of these attacks is a lot of times a few of them use holes that have not been patched or even identified. Most of them use holes that have been identified, have been patched. So start with your fundamentals, right? Keep all that stuff fixed. Make sure you get your flash alerts on the applications and the OS. Set up the features that are free in the product that don't really, in any way complicate your life. It just, yes, let me turn that on, or do dissimilar, whatever, that none of that makes your life harder. It doesn't make the machine slower. It doesn't make sure the backup's less efficient, and it's free. So you're right, Sean. Let's do those things definitely, and then look about what, don't approach it from let me change the infrastructure. Let me approach it and say, what do I want to protect against? Because some of those things are relatively rare. Some of them are more common. So let's hit them more as easily as possible at front.
I instantly think of the expression not being able to see the forest through the trees, Dan, when you say stuff like that, and Sean. And maybe we use this as a kind of a slight commercial for the program that you guys do, Dan. But, as you mentioned, right, there are a lot of things inside the technologies that you might use in your data protection environment to take advantage of to make it stronger. One, any things come to mind? A lot of this stuff is common sense, but sometimes you're so in it, you can't kind of back out of it and think about kind of what you're trying to accomplish. Any things we haven't mentioned that might be common sense or obvious? And then two, maybe talk a little bit about the program that you guys run every once in a while.
From those obvious things, I'll be honest with you, I've been a backup admin since late 90s. So we're used to having an unreasonable amount of access to the data, to the machines, because we touch pretty much every machine. I can't be going through 30 different people to go fix a problem with a config file and things. And that's got to stop, right? Having everyone in the IT kind of know the password to the backup engine and all those kind of things, or don't use, randomized passwords on the clients because it makes it hard in case I want to go over there and log in. You can't get away with that stuff anymore. You can't.
Yeah, you used to be able to get away with it, right?
Right.
You just, behind a firewall, you're okay. These days, doesn't work like that.
Right. And it's one of those things that, the security office is making sure everybody's doing everything possible. So if they find out you've got those used security holes in some kind of audit, it's going to be a career-changing event at that point of not doing the obvious things. When you talk about the event, you're talking about the cyber resiliency assessment, or are you talking about our workshop we give periodically?
I think it's the workshop that you guys do periodically that's of interest.
So the ATG, Advanced Technology Group, we do a cyber resiliency workshop. It's 2 days, and it talks about everything from disk safeguarded copy, the NIST cycle, as well as the cyber assessment. And how we start the workshop is we actually kind of do a little live role play where we say, here's a customer, here's a common set of answers to the cyber assessment. And then we go through and talk about different technologies and how they can help. And then we show the score of the assessment after that, if a lot of these things are implemented. So it's very well worth your time. And we're trying to open up more and more people. Right now we have issues of just not having enough seats available, but we're trying to record more of the content and sort of have a side curricula and watch this space. We'll inform you when we can get a lot of that done.
How often, and few questions, right? How often do you do those exercises?
Because we offer so many workshops, it's limited pretty much to one per quarter.
One per quarter.
So our next one's in May, I believe. I have to double check. I'm sorry.
And just out of curiosity, is really, I'm sure most of the people that attend are IBM data protection clients, but is this so specific to IBM backup technology that if someone wanted to kind of get smarter about just doing hardening of their data protection environment, regardless of the solution they use, could they attend?
They certainly could. Because of the limited seats right now, people have to, kind of ask to attend and be nominated. And it's generally associated with customers who've just made a decision to go with an IBM technology of one sort of another, as to help them plan out how they use that technology. But go ahead, sorry.
Have you received any feedback or war stories or interesting anecdotes out of these classes?
So we do ask customers if your company or organization has experienced an attack, and a lot of them say yes, but they don't provide details. As you can imagine, and if they did, I wouldn't be able to share outside of those discussions. But to kind of get back to Steve's question about whether it has to be specific to IBM stuff, a lot of everything we've talked about today, outside of a couple of specific features, can apply to any backup software. And that's true of disk snapshots, replicated copies as a recovery point on both sides. That's any high-end disk subsystem will have those capabilities. Now we believe strongly that we have the best one, and we've got specific features like safeguarded copy, but in theory, most of it is very generic to equivalent levels of technology.
Great. Thanks, Dan. I appreciate that. So a big part of why we talk about data resilience is because making sure your data, your most important asset, is protected. Randy has been our chief inspector when it comes to all of the things that attack your data these days. Randy, want to share with us the latest one?
Yeah, so this is always pretty fertile ground. I mean, as I think I've done in previous sessions, I kind of go into my browser and spin the wheel of misfortune. I have a couple of canned searches in place that just go out and look for cyber events or data protection failures and backup failures that have occurred within the past 24 hours. And invariably it brings back like 5 million responses. So the bad news is it's an easy thing to find. So something Tricia alluded to a little while ago is there was there's a major concern, obviously, and you saw this manifest in the SolarWinds attack last year. There's a major concern that there's huge forces marshaling around the world attempting to organize and execute these massive cyber assaults, on state-owned entities. So it's not just enterprises and companies and individuals. It's now sort of escalating to the point where they're targeting governmental systems and operational systems at a very, very high and very massively scaled level. So there's this new consortium that's been put together that's being called the Cyber Polygon, that is doing a series of simulations and exercises around trying to trying to model and simulate and plan for and prepare for these kind of cyber attacks. So it's being run by the World Economic Forum, and the concepts are things that have been drawn from more traditional cyber resiliency platforms, whether it's NIST best practices or some of the hardening techniques that Dan talked about earlier, and how those can be applied in a more broad-based, more standards-based, and more easily adaptable manner. So developing this kind of secure ecosystem in partnership with private industry and the government sector. So it's an interesting initiative. It's, I guess, somewhat ironic in the sense that it's being driven out of Europe, and Russia's very heavily involved. There are Russian cybercrime organizations and cyber prevention and security organizations involved in this, which seems a little counterintuitive at first until you consider that obviously there's always going to be unrest and there's always going to be cyber threats within these regimes that have in some cases state-sponsored cyber terrorism in many ways. So it's interesting. I think it's somewhat encouraging in the sense that it shows a level of collaboration and partnership, public-private sector partnership, that is probably a good thing because it will result in better best practices, more resilient environments. The flip side of it, of course, is that it's kind of scary that people are planning for and simulating cyber attacks occurring at this magnitude. I mean, it's pretty terrifying. So I'm not sure how I feel about it. I'm a little conflicted about it, but it's really interesting. I guess I'll choose to emphasize the positive aspects of it, but these are scary times for sure.
It's good that we're prepared. It's bad that we have to be so prepared, right?
Yeah, exactly. Although it is a cool name, the Cyber Polygon, and the last thing I'll just mention is, at some point we got to talk about the truck. All right, we got to talk about the IBM Cyber X-Force Command truck, which is super cool. And what can I say? I'm kind of a truck guy. You are too. But this is kind of cool, actually. I don't think we have one in North America yet. They just have them in Europe, but it's actually a mobile lab. It's a hardened environment that they can wheel up to your site, fully self-contained, air gapped from all, communications, to do recovery and simulation exercise. So it's actually really cool. Anyway.
Tricia, you can be the driver.
Yeah, it's
yes.
gotta be electric.
I'm sure that's in the planning stages. I got to believe that's in the planning stages. Yeah. So anyway, that is this week's yikes, terrifying cyber news.
Yikes is right. Well, Trish, you know what that means. It's your time. It's tool time. What's the tool of the week today?
So today's tool tip has to do with what we do around GAs of new versions of our product, so that we can educate the field. And so these people on the team here, we've got Sean, we've got Steve and myself, and we put out a lot of information that's there. And I try to get a lot of it, and I know Steve does too, out on YouTube and all, so that it's there when you're ready to put that new release into actual, run that in your environment. So what we do usually when we know there's a release coming is we'll start gathering all of the features and functions that are going to be coming out. And I'll work with the developers and testers to actually record demos and get those out for the YouTube consumption so that you can see, how does this work? What does it look like? And then Sean and I will go through and create these very technical decks. Actually, they're not extremely technical. They're kind of a mid-level, where we take what the developers are training us on and we kind of condense it into an hour and a half technical piece. And we'll record this also and put it out on YouTube. So you've got a presentation and you've got demos to back that. And then for the business partners and IBMers, Steve and some of the architects will go through and create a sales deck so that you get kind of a higher level, and we'll do a webcast on that in conjunction with the technical details that Sean and I will record, so that you can, the people who need to kind of the salesy stuff will get the higher level. And those are usually saved also so you can replay them if you don't catch them live. So look for the decks, the PowerPoints, and of course all of that's backed up with information out in the Knowledge Center and documentation, and then look for the demos out on YouTube as well.
I think it's important to mention that, Tricia, and thank you for doing that, because April 27th, in a couple of weeks, we have a new release coming out. So we talked a little bit about the fact that 7.1 is being end of life, and folks are going to be looking to go to kind of the latest and greatest release. And as Dan had mentioned in his talk, right, you always want to try to stay as current as possible. And we look at what new things have come into infiltrate systems and how do we fix them internally. And I'm sure some of that has made it into the new product. So that'll be available on April 27th. And we'll also drop in the video, the link to your YouTube channel, because you do put together a lot of great content, especially on currency of things. So I think it's worthwhile to point folks back to that and have them take a look.
And I think that's a really good point, because Sean and I usually don't cover all of the APARs and fixes that go in. We just cover the new functionality or new platforms that are being supported. So you're right. Underneath all of that is also the fixes that you and Dan are talking about that are really critical for keeping up.
Great. Dan, we want to thank you very, very much today for your expertise and for you coming on the podcast. It's a breath of fresh air to get someone with some deep knowledge on here to kind of help us better understand and communicate to the audience a little bit about things they need to be thinking about in order to be putting together a robust and resilient data protection environment. So thank you again very much.
Yes. Thank you, Dan. Appreciate your time.
Very welcome. It's a lot of fun.
Great. Thanks, everybody. And until next week, or actually, no, for the next couple of weeks.
A little hiatus coming up.
A little hiatus coming up. Give us a couple of weeks and we will be back at you live. Thank you.
And you can catch up on all the new GA stuff while we're gone.
There you go.
Brilliant. Thanks, everybody.